Well, they got to Chicago by train, and my my mother's grandfather had furnished an apartment for them on Laughlin Street. It was a lovely gray stone house, a 3-flat, that today would be rehabbed into a mini mansion. The children were awed. There was a horsehair sofa, overstuffed chairs, gas light in the sconces. The luxury was something they'd never imagined, but it was not to my grandmother's liking. She said, "How can you live with people above you and people under you? I want trees, I want grass, I want flowers." She was raised in rural atmosphere. Well, every day this woman without language, without the English language, would get on a streetcar in a different route. And she traveled all the different routes until she came to the end of the line. If she didn't like what she saw, she'd come back and try the next day. Well, when the train she was on, the streetcar that she was on, stopped in Maywood, she saw a wild rose bush. She saw plants and trees and tall grasses, and she said, "This is for me." She got off, it was the end of the stop, and she walked several blocks to the heart of the little town. And what did she see but a sign in Yiddish, "The Kosher Butcher"? Well, Maywood could afford a kosher butcher because its little synagogue took in Melrose Park, Forest Park, Westchester, enough to make a small congregation. And of course, they needed kosher food. So Suchman the butcher was in business. My grandmother went in and they had a Yiddish conversation of where she should look to rent a house. And she even arranged a job for her husband in the shul. They couldn't afford a rabbi, but they needed somebody who was learned, who could marry and bury people, teach all the children, fire up the furnace, sweep the floor, and be the caretaker. And that's what they did. They moved to Maywood. My grandmother found in this frame house that I remember so well, there was a black preacher who lived on the main floor. The town was supported by the American Can Factory, and workers from the South were brought up to work in the factory, and he was a preacher. My mother said he had the only telephone, so he would knock on the wall and the girls would run down to answer the telephone when they were of dating age. Well, in 1913, there was a recession in the country, and many people lost their jobs. The American factory was laying off people, and the preacher wanted to go back down south. My grandmother was able to buy the house by paying the interest, the back payments of interest, and keep the mortgage until she could begin to pay on the mortgage. I don't know how this immigrant woman figured all this out, but she did. She had great fortitude. And then the home was hers. And the upstairs she could rent out to her daughters or whoever else in the family. She wouldn't rent to anybody else. They might put a nail in the wall, God forbid. So when I was a toddler, it was our time to move into the apartment upstairs. The times that we had in Maywood were such happy times for little kids. The two of my closest playmates were my cousin Marvin, who was a year younger, and my cousin David, who was a year older. I wasn't allowed to play with children who weren't Jewish. I can see where my grandmother would have these biases and fears because of their experiences in Europe. At any rate, I was very lucky because my cousin Marvin and I would sit on the curb, and as the traffic whizzed by on Washington Boulevard, we would call out the names of the cars. it wasn't difficult for 3 and 4 and 5-year-old children to do that because the cars had very distinctive hood ornaments. And we'd see who could call it out the fastest. My cousin David was very, very creative. Across the street of our house was a memorial park from World War I. Well, it must have been before then because this was already in maybe 27, 28. From World War I, they had a caisson, and they had red and white painted rocks making a flag laid in the lawn, and they had all kinds of entertainments. There was a tennis court, and there was a miniature golf course. David, at the age of 7, was determined to make a golf course in our backyard until my grandmother saw him digging holes. But he designed a course. He used cans for the tunnels. He dug little tunnels for the moats. He stuck in little flowers and weeds for decoration. We used sticks for golf sticks, and we used the little apples that never ripened and fell to the ground. Those were our golf balls. And when I think of the brains and creativity of this little boy, and of course we followed every one of his plans. Unfortunately, this little boy contracted rheumatic fever and died at the age of 10. That's another story. When it came time for school was just maybe 2 blocks down Washington Boulevard. I remember very well my father gave me instructions. You must clasp your hands and not talk. By the time I got to school, I was so fearful that I might make a mistake and be chastised. My father was really a very jovial guy. My mother, who was depressive at that time, we didn't know what that was yet. He was as optimistic and bright and fun-loving as could be. I remember Saturday nights, my father bought the funnies, and I would lie next to him up to his chest, very fleshy. My father was a little chubby. And his arm around me, and he read the funnies out loud, chuckling to himself, having such a good time. Happy Hooligan, Felix the Cat, Andy Gump, Gasoline Alley. He enjoyed that so much. My father was a traveling salesman, so he only had Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday at home. Monday morning he was off again. But Saturday afternoon he took me to the movies because he really wanted to see those Western serials. And there were many of them on Saturday afternoons, like the kids have cartoons today. We had Westerns and jungle movies. My daddy always took me on a Saturday afternoon, and we had such a good time. Of course, I loved the movies because my mother took me often. The worst thing for my mother was to be alone with her condition. And she looked to fill her time any way she could. And every time the movie changed, in those days it was like 3 times a week, she would take me, and at one time I remember the sign said adults only. It was a Mae West movie. And my mother told the ushers, don't worry, she won't understand anything. She'd be surprised how much even a little child can garner from the attitudes and actions of what's going on film. My mother was having a hard time when she was pregnant with my little brother. There's 5 years difference between us, because though she slept with curlers, she'd wake up and her hair would be straight, and it would make her cry. She broke out with pimples, and she would cry. So she'd say, Rosie, let's go to the movies, but we'll walk with the side streets. I didn't know what side streets were, but my mother didn't want to be seen by her friends. Often we would stop at the drugstore, which was at the corner where the movie theater was, and have a hot chocolate with saltines. My mother liked the combination of sweet and salt. And to this day, I always want saltines with something sweet.